Good morning, Joyce.
Good morning, Anne.
Do you want to talk about adoptees and fierce independence?
Sure.
Because I was out walking Bird this morning and I had the sense it just things kind of piled up in front of my mind about how I feel that I am supposed to do everything for myself. But that is also not always true. That I also have the desire and I've had the experience of being acting and being treated like a baby kind of and having everything taken care of for me. And those two states are very familiar to me. What's less familiar is a shared experience of, well, one of the things I like about working with you is we share the load, but that feels special and uncommon. Um, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I always have something to say. Who knows if it's worth anything, um, but I think that adoptees in particular come into the world in a funny way. Not only adoptees, there are other people who have, maybe their mother dies in childbirth, and there are other, it's not just us, but we're a cohort that you and I are talking about and that have a special experience. Now, we're talking about those that are adopted at birth, the experience, and I think it's always important to think about the wide situation of adoption. It's not always the same. There are so many variables, and it's important to keep those in mind. But when you think about the adopted person at birth, their first experience is not just the separation of coming out into the world, which every human experiences, but being dramatically moved to an entirely different environment. And the that infant already is familiar with voices and feelings and food and touch and other internal things that have happened. So there's a familiarity that is immediately shifted uh, for them, and that has its positive and negative impacts. I think it's great to be independent. I mean, adoptees are survivors because they had to undergo a huge initial trauma to get to their next stop. And it gives them a great deal of fortitude. And I think, that's a good thing to have, but it's sort of sad to think you have to be that independent person all the time. And it is a feeling that many adoptees express. And you're right, the other side of that is enmeshment, just completely enmeshing yourself. And that's an instinct to go back inside and to be as you were and to feel totally taken care of. And because of the stark initial experience, that's a drive in some way that happens. And neither of those situations are particularly good for anyone if that's all you've got. Enmeshment doesn't allow you to individuate and to become your true self. And, this fierce independence doesn't allow you to connect and be part of some other things in the world, some other people in the world. And so the best thing would be to figure out how to be somewhere in between. And I think that's very hard because if you look at Erik Erikson's developmental stages, the first stage is trust, mistrust. And adoptees have a difficult time trusting or overtrust. And I think that's symbolic of why it's either enmeshment or fierce individuality. And I think, I mean, we could go on and on, but basically, I think human beings are interrelational beings. You can't be totally independent. people who are totally independent are failure to thrive. You can't exist. You need other humans, and relationships heal people. So it's very, very important to be part of a we, not just I. And I think that's a hard lesson if you don't trust people.
You know, it's funny, I don't know if this is related, but Steve Jobs came to mind, like how he treated people at Apple, that fierce independence that seemed to cost him a lot. I was also wondering about the nervous system because I had never thought about that, getting all your needs met as going sort of back into the womb, but that makes so much sense. And that's a sense in the body of like fawning, I think, or collapsing, right? Where when I think about that, all my muscles get soft and it's it's more than relaxing. It's like sort of a giving up or giving in or something. And then I think about the fierce independence as being like in fight or flight, where the body's like completely activated and ready for any challenge. And that when you talked about the in between, that would be more of a regulated nervous system, the between place. And I was also wondering, do you know stories about? Okay, I have to think of a better way to put this. Okay, it's going to be a dumb question, but you'll answer it well.
No question is
Yeah,
dumb.
yeah, yeah. I I was thinking when you said, so many of us learn to be fiercely independent from when we were relinquished. But I don't know what your story is, but there's the 10 weeks from when I was relinquished to when I was adopted that I don't know what happened. And so in my mind, I have a story of I see myself alone in a crib but I have no corroborating evidence for that. And has there been research done about what actually happened to to babies when they were relinquished?
No, I'm sure there is because there's more and more research as time goes on. And I used to be, I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of research in the early days of my work in the late 70s, early 80s. So it was easy to keep up. It's harder to keep up, and there are international studies, and so I'm not an expert on what the up to the minute research is,
Mm,
but there are. I think from the adoptees' perspective, in people that I've worked with, and both as a therapist and as a colleague, I've seen people need to find out what happened as best they could. And I'm thinking of two examples. One was an adoptee who wrote a beautiful piece. She gave me permission, and I used to read it in a keynote once that I did. But it was I won't remember it perfectly, and she's eloquent. But she wrote about the experience of having her first baby and how that gave her insight into herself, and she watched how people took care of the baby and how how nurses and doctors examined the baby and how she wouldn't let that child out of her sight. I did the same thing. I had rooming in. I wouldn't let the baby be taken to the place where all the babies are lined up because, the fear of having someone take the child. And so this young mother, what she talked about was how frightened she was to take care of this baby and to make sure it was safe and that it would be kept. And it was all her own self. It wasn't really, well, it was about the baby, but it was also about her, baby her. And she talked about being on the elevator and having people bump into her, and she's holding her baby in the wheelchair and her husband's pushing the wheelchair, and how frightened she was about these other people breathing on her child and pushing, and then she got frightened and angry at her husband because the baby seat was in the back, and she had to get in the back too because she couldn't leave the child back there alone. And then she kept yelling at him to drive slower, drive slower.
mm,
Her fear and her inability to trust herself or the world was really her reworking what happened to her initially.
Mm,
And even those few minutes, and she had had a difficult experience at her birth. She was in a foster home for 6 months before she was placed in her adopted family. And we don't need to go into that. But anyway, it just, people do think about that. The other important piece is by Sue Harris O'Connor, who's
mm.
one of my favorites. And Sue and I worked together for many years, and she's written beautiful things and performed them. She's really
I've
sort of,
seen her. She's amazing.
I know, and I used to call her the Anna Devere Smith of adoption because she would do these pieces that were incredible. But one of them was about her baby self, and she is transracially adopted. And when she was born, it was, I don't remember her age or what, she's younger than me, but not hugely younger. And because she was biracial, the nurses and psychologists and doctors kept notes to watch to see her skin change because they were racist and because the placement, if she were lighter skinned, there was more chance of her getting a placement. And it's appalling and important to read the notes. She went back to the department and to the hospital and got the notes. And, some of the people were strictly observing her and they were clearly making racist remarks. Not, I mean, obviously racist, not trying to be mean, but clearly being horrible in terms of their racism. And one of the things that she paid attention to was the psychologist who was having her do things to watch her grasp. She was about 14 months old when she was finally placed for adoption. So she was a long time in foster care. And the psychologist would do tests every once in a while. And she said she had no pictures of herself for her baby self, but that the verbal pictures that the psychologist wrote were what warmed her heart because
Mm,
he talked about her reaching for the rattle and her smile and described her in a loving way and in a positive way, and that was so important to her. So she started to learn more and more about what happened to her during that time. And I'm going to send it to you if you haven't read it. It's very beautiful. But also, she talks about the foster parent who was very callous, who took babies to hold them for a period of time till they went to their forever family.
mm,
And they didn't really care about those babies. And
mm,
when she went to see the foster mother, she said, "Did you name me?" And she said, "I wouldn't name you." I mean, she was very haughty and awful. So it was important for her to know what happened, and it was very hard to hear what happened as she went through her journey. And the piece that she does is called My First Birthday,
mm,
as she talks about the fact that no one, acknowledged her first steps, her first words, and there was her first birthday that was never celebrated. And so when she would do this, she would sort of give herself um, the important hug that she needed to express who she had been all of those months and all of those weeks before she was finally in the placement that she ended up in.
mm. Can that be a helpful thing for like someone like me who doesn't know what happened? Is it helpful to create a narrative of what you would like to have been?
I think everyone needs to. I don't think everyone wants to, but I think that if you do, I think Sue really wanted that information and it was revealing.
Mhm,
And I think it was very, very important. I was adopted at 10 days.
mm,
all I know from my birth mother is that she watched the car take me away.
Mm,
Um, but I must have just been in the care of nurses. I mean, my birth mother wasn't, well, she might have been in the hospital for a couple of days. I don't know what the protocol was in those days.
mm,
Uh, but but when you've had a longer period, like 14 months, where
mm,
were you?
mm,
Um, 10 weeks is what you said is a long time too. That's 2.5 months. That's
mm.
a lot of developmental moves that you're making. And yeah, it might be, and people who do international searches, many of the Korean adoptees that I've worked with were able to find the foster families way before they could find their birth families. And I think it's been helpful for them. And in many cases, there's another great story. Uh, Phil Bertelsen did a movie called is it Outside In or Inside Out? And it's about he was in foster care till he was 4, and then he was placed for adoption. He's also a transracial adoption. And to make a long story short, he had a loving foster family, and he had a brother and sister in that foster family who he had vague memories of. And when he found them, they remembered him and they didn't know where he went. He was their baby brother, and all of a sudden he was gone. And
Mm,
that, and you know, in the United States, you weren't allowed to adopt if you were a foster parent. They
mm,
needed holding environments to place kids with their permanent families. So for
mm.
many, many years, you were not allowed, even if you had bonded, connected, if it was a good situation. Nope, you couldn't do it. So it was really amazing for Phil to find his foster family because they were extremely loving and they were thrilled to know what happened to him.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm realizing as we're talking that um, you can get used to something. I've gotten used to not knowing what happened the first 10 weeks, but when I focus on it, it feels like a missing tooth. Like that, and when you have a missing tooth, you can't stop thinking about it. And I think it would feel really good to create a narrative that I could lean on, because otherwise it's like an empty gap in a fence, and you can't lean against it because there's nothing there. And so at least maybe my brain could relax a little bit, some part of it could relax if I told it a story. So I'm gonna try and see. Um, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Well, I think that's pretty good. I think, it's an interesting, something to ponder.
Mm.
It was Eddie Murphy that used to do things that make you go, hmm. I think that's sort of what we've been doing, thinking about these issues in adoption and giving them a little more credibility.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's really important to stir the pot so that things don't settle on the bottom and kind of fester. So you and I are gonna take a break for a while. We're gonna create a new class. We have to spend some time focused on that. But this has been really wonderful. I appreciate it. I feel like I have this little treasure trove of my time with Joyce. So thank you for doing these with me.
I love it. Thank you.
Me too. Enjoy the rain over there, Joyce. Stay dry.
Okay.